The night air in Manhattan carried a particular kind of quiet, the kind that settles only in winter, when the city exhales and the streets briefly forget their own noise. Snow clung lightly to the edges of sidewalks, reflecting the glow of streetlights in soft halos of amber and white. Cars moved steadily but without urgency, their tires whispering against cold pavement. To most people passing through Midtown that evening, it was just another December night in New York, ordinary, forgettable, almost peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, a powerful life was nearing its end, and an entire criminal empire was standing unknowingly at the edge of transformation. Paul Castellano did not look like a man who ruled the most powerful mafia family in America. He was large, imposing in stature, yet reserved in presence. There was no flashy confidence in his walk, no hunger for attention in his eyes. He was not the kind of boss whose name echoed in nightclubs or appeared in tabloids. He preferred quiet rooms, long conversations behind closed doors, and the comfort of distance. Power, to him, was not something to be displayed. It was something to be managed, controlled, and protected, often by keeping people at arm's length. For decades, Castellano had lived in the shadows of American life, shaping industries, influencing unions, and directing streams of money that flowed silently through construction sites, meatpacking plants, and corporate offices. His decisions affected thousands of lives, yet most of the city had never heard his name. He believed invisibility was strength. The less you were seen, the safer you were. The less you were heard, the longer you survived. It was a philosophy built on caution, order, and an almost obsessive need for control. That need for control extended not only to his criminal enterprises but to the people around him. Castellano trusted systems more than individuals, rules more than relationships. He believed loyalty was something to be enforced through structure, not earned through warmth. To him, emotional closeness was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous. In a world where betrayal often arrived disguised as friendship, distance felt like protection. As the car moved through the city that night, Castellano sat insulated from the cold, wrapped in layers of power and habit. He had lived long enough to see rivals fall, alliances fracture, and law enforcement grow smarter and more relentless. He had survived internal wars and external pressure by staying removed, by allowing others to handle the noise of the streets while he focused on the numbers, the strategy, the long view. It was a method that had worked, for a long time. Yet the very traits that kept him alive were also quietly isolating him. While he ruled from a mansion on Staten Island, far from the neighborhoods where the Gambino family had built its reputation, resentment simmered among those who felt abandoned by his leadership. Street-level captains, men who risked their freedom daily, saw a boss who demanded profits but offered little loyalty in return. They whispered that Castellano lived like a corporate executive, not a mafia don. They said he had forgotten where he came from. Castellano heard those whispers, or at least sensed them. His world had grown increasingly narrow, his circle of trust shrinking year by year. Meetings became rarer. Conversations became shorter. Surveillance by federal agents intensified, reinforcing his belief that caution was not paranoia but survival instinct. Every phone call could be recorded. Every driver could be compromised. Every familiar face carried the possibility of betrayal. In this way, Castellano's life became quieter but heavier. The silence around him was not peaceful, it was tense, dense with unspoken fears. Even moments of luxury, fine meals, elegant rooms, carefully arranged routines, were shadowed by suspicion. He ruled an empire, yet stood alone within it. The paradox of his power was simple and cruel: the higher he rose, the fewer people he could trust. To outsiders, the American mafia was often imagined as loud and violent, driven by impulsive men and sudden bloodshed. Castellano represented something very different. His vision was calculated, almost bureaucratic. Crime, in his mind, was a business, and business required discipline. Emotion clouded judgment. Tradition mattered only insofar as it preserved order. He was not interested in being loved. He wanted to be obeyed. But obedience without loyalty is fragile. It holds only as long as fear outweighs ambition. And ambition, in the mafia world, never sleeps. Beneath Castellano's carefully maintained structure, younger men watched and waited. They measured his weaknesses, counted his absences, and imagined alternatives. They asked themselves quiet questions in darker rooms: what happens when a boss no longer listens? What happens when distance becomes indifference? That December night, as Castellano approached a familiar restaurant in Midtown, these questions hovered unseen, like mist in the cold air. He believed the systems he had built would protect him. He believed protocol, hierarchy, and caution were stronger than emotion. He believed, above all, that his position insulated him from impulsive acts. History, however, often turns not on logic but on timing. It turns on small decisions made by people who feel unheard, underestimated, or cornered. Castellano's story was never about sudden recklessness. It was about slow accumulation, of power, of resentment, of distance. His end, when it came, would not be chaotic. It would be precise, efficient, and devastatingly symbolic. As the city moved around him, unaware and indifferent, the snow continued to fall lightly, softening edges and muting sound. New York, vast and eternal, gave no sign that one of its hidden architects was nearing his final moments. For Paul Castellano, the boss who trusted no one, the silence he had lived by was about to become absolute. And in that silence, a new era of the American Mafia was already waiting to begin. Brooklyn in the early decades of the 20th century was a place shaped by motion and memory. Ships arrived daily at nearby docks, carrying immigrants who brought little more than language, tradition, and a quiet determination to survive. Streets were crowded with pushcarts, narrow row houses, and families bound tightly together by necessity. For Italian immigrants, especially those from Sicily, family was not simply important, it was everything. Loyalty was learned early, silence was expected, and respect for hierarchy was woven into daily life long before any child understood its meaning. Paul Castellano was born into this world in 1915, surrounded by an extended family whose roots were already entwined with the undercurrents of organized crime. His upbringing was not marked by dramatic poverty or overt criminal training, but by something subtler and far more influential: proximity. He grew up close enough to power to observe it quietly, to understand its rhythms without having to chase it recklessly. Crime, in his world, was not romanticized or loudly discussed. It was treated as business, as responsibility, as something that existed alongside ordinary life rather than separate from it. The Castellano household reflected traditional Italian values: discipline, obedience, and deference to elders. Children were expected to listen more than they spoke. Questions were discouraged, especially about matters that did not concern them. This environment shaped Paul deeply. He learned early that information was valuable, that silence could be protective, and that those who spoke too much often invited trouble. Unlike other boys who sought attention or excitement in the streets, Paul was observant, reserved, and cautious. One of the most defining elements of his early life was his family's connection to Carlo Gambino, a man who would later become one of the most powerful mafia bosses in American history. Gambino was not merely an associate or distant acquaintance, he was family by marriage. This bond placed young Paul near the center of influence without requiring him to prove himself through violence or bravado. It was an advantage that would shape his entire trajectory, but it also came with expectations. Blood ties demanded loyalty. They demanded discretion. And they demanded patience. Brooklyn neighborhoods during this era were self-contained worlds. The streets taught lessons just as clearly as the home did. Boys learned quickly who belonged, who held influence, and who should not be crossed. Authority figures were not always police officers or politicians, often, they were men whose names were spoken quietly, with respect. Paul watched these dynamics unfold daily. He saw how disputes were settled without official involvement, how favors created obligations, and how reputation carried more weight than force. Unlike many future gangsters, Castellano did not begin his life with dreams of street dominance. There is little evidence of him engaging in youthful delinquency or seeking validation through confrontation. Instead, he gravitated toward stability and structure. He left school early, as many boys of his generation did, to work and contribute to the household. This early responsibility reinforced his belief that life was about function, not fantasy. Survival required planning. Success required discipline. His family background normalized the presence of crime without glorifying it. This distinction mattered. Paul did not grow up idolizing gunmen or seeking quick status. He saw crime as an extension of economic reality, a means to secure influence and protect one's own. It was not chaotic in his mind, it was organized, deliberate, and hierarchical. These ideas would later form the foundation of his leadership philosophy. The influence of Sicilian culture cannot be overstated in understanding Castellano's worldview. In that tradition, trust was rare and betrayal unforgettable. Loyalty was expected without question, but trust was granted sparingly. One learned to rely on systems, family structures, codes of conduct, established roles, rather than individual promises. Paul absorbed these lessons quietly. He became someone who believed that order mattered more than affection, and that distance could be a form of safety. As he moved into adulthood, Castellano's path was shaped less by dramatic turning points and more by steady alignment. He married young and began building a family of his own, further anchoring him in responsibility. While others chased excitement, he pursued security. He was drawn toward legitimate business fronts, meat distribution, wholesale operations, and other industries that blurred the line between lawful commerce and illicit control. These environments suited him. They were structured, predictable, and profitable. His early involvement in these businesses taught him something critical: money flowed more reliably through contracts than through crimes of impulse. Violence disrupted operations. Attention attracted law enforcement. Quiet influence, on the other hand, allowed systems to grow undisturbed. Castellano learned to see the mafia not as a street organization but as an economic engine. This perspective set him apart from many of his contemporaries and would later become both his greatest strength and his most controversial trait. Family gatherings and private conversations exposed him to the inner workings of organized crime without requiring him to participate directly at first. He listened. He remembered. He learned who mattered and who did not. By the time he formally entered mafia life, he did so with an understanding that many never acquired. He did not need to prove his loyalty with reckless acts. His loyalty was assumed through blood, and his competence demonstrated through results. Yet this same upbringing also distanced him emotionally from others. Castellano was not known for warmth or camaraderie. Even in his youth, he was serious, deliberate, and inward-looking. Relationships were transactional rather than emotional. Trust was conditional. These traits, developed early, would harden over time, shaping a leader who valued efficiency over connection. Brooklyn, with its crowded streets and tight-knit communities, taught Castellano how power could exist quietly. You did not need to announce yourself to be feared. You did not need admiration to command obedience. Influence, when properly managed, spoke for itself. Paul carried these lessons with him as he rose steadily through the ranks, never rushing, never drawing unnecessary attention. By the time he emerged as a significant figure within the Gambino organization, his foundations were already set. He was not a product of sudden ambition or violent opportunity. He was the result of environment, lineage, and a worldview forged in silence. His roots were not glamorous, but they were strong. And they anchored him to a belief that would guide every decision he made: power lasts longest when it is hidden, and trust, once given, should never be given freely. In these early years, long before the mansion on Staten Island or the storms that would later surround his name, Paul Castellano was simply a man shaped by family, culture, and quiet observation. The boy who learned to listen instead of speak would one day rule through distance. And the lessons he absorbed in Brooklyn's narrow streets would echo throughout his rise, and ultimately, his fall. By the time Paul Castellano reached his late 20s and early 30s, it was becoming clear to those around him that he did not fit the familiar mold of the American gangster. While others built reputations on street corners, in smoky bars, or through displays of toughness, Castellano moved in quieter spaces. He was not absent from the criminal world, but he approached it with the mindset of an administrator rather than a soldier. Where many sought recognition through risk, he preferred insulation through planning. In the neighborhoods where mafia influence thrived, status was often earned through visibility: who you knew, what you dared, how loudly your name traveled. Castellano, however, seemed almost indifferent to such measures. He rarely spent time socializing in the traditional hangouts. He avoided unnecessary confrontation. His confidence did not come from physical dominance but from an understanding of systems. He believed that real power was exercised behind desks, not on sidewalks. This philosophy guided his early involvement in organized crime. Castellano gravitated toward rackets that required coordination, oversight, and patience. He found comfort in businesses that could be scaled quietly: meat distribution, construction-related ventures, labor arrangements that relied on contracts rather than coercion alone. These were not glamorous operations, but they were reliable. Money arrived steadily, disputes could be managed with negotiation, and attention from authorities remained minimal if handled correctly. Those who worked with him noticed his meticulous nature. Castellano paid attention to details others ignored. He remembered figures, timelines, and obligations. He disliked surprises and planned carefully to avoid them. In meetings, he listened more than he spoke, weighing information before responding. This restraint often gave the impression of aloofness, but beneath it was calculation. He understood that every word spoken could become leverage for someone else. Unlike many men rising through mafia ranks at the time, Castellano did not rely on a personal crew of enforcers to establish his authority. Instead, he relied on trust built through consistency. When he promised returns, he delivered. When he expected compliance, he structured incentives to ensure it. His influence grew not through fear alone but through the quiet reliability of outcomes. People learned that working with Castellano meant stability, even if it meant limited personal access to him. Yet this approach also created distance. Street-level operators, accustomed to leaders who shared their risks and celebrated their victories, found Castellano difficult to read. He did not laugh easily. He did not bond over shared hardship. To many, he seemed more like a corporate executive than a criminal partner. Some admired this professionalism. Others resented it, sensing that his loyalty lay more with profits than with people. Castellano himself seemed unconcerned by these perceptions. He believed that familiarity bred weakness. Emotional closeness, in his view, clouded judgment and complicated decisions. He preferred clear roles, defined expectations, and measurable results. If someone performed well, they were rewarded. If they did not, they were replaced. This was not personal to him, it was simply business. His reputation as a man of structure reached Carlo Gambino's ears not through rumor but through results. Gambino valued order above all else, and Castellano's style aligned closely with his own philosophy. Where others caused headaches through impulsive behavior, Castellano solved problems quietly. He did not create unnecessary enemies. He did not attract headlines. He kept operations profitable and contained. These traits made him increasingly valuable to the organization. As Castellano's responsibilities expanded, so did his detachment from street-level life. He delegated enforcement to others, trusting intermediaries to handle confrontations. This further reinforced his identity as an overseer rather than a participant. He spent more time reviewing accounts, discussing logistics, and planning long-term strategies. The criminal world, as he experienced it, became less about survival and more about optimization. This shift did not go unnoticed. Among younger, more aggressive members of the family, Castellano's rise sparked quiet frustration. They believed that leadership should be earned through shared risk and visible strength. Castellano represented an alternative path, one that bypassed the rituals of street credibility. His ascent challenged traditional ideas of what a mafia leader should be. Yet his success was undeniable. Profits increased. Operations ran smoothly. Conflicts were minimized. Castellano's influence grew precisely because he avoided chaos. He understood that law enforcement thrived on disorder. Predictability, he believed, was the enemy of prosecution. By maintaining routines and minimizing disruptions, he reduced exposure. This belief extended to his personal conduct. Castellano avoided excess. He dressed conservatively, maintained regular habits, and kept his movements predictable. He did not indulge in the nightlife that consumed many of his peers. His pleasures were controlled, his routines disciplined. Even leisure was structured. This consistency reinforced his sense of control and further distanced him from the volatility of the streets. Despite this, Castellano was not naive. He understood the violence that underpinned the system he benefited from. He simply believed it should be used sparingly, as a last resort rather than a primary tool. Violence attracted attention. Attention invited investigation. Investigation threatened stability. In his mind, a well-run organization should rarely need to remind others of its capacity for force. This pragmatic approach earned him both allies and critics. Those who valued profit and longevity aligned with him. Those who thrived on action and reputation found him restrictive. Over time, this divide would deepen, but in these early years, it remained manageable. Castellano's authority was still growing, and many were willing to accept his methods as long as the money flowed. His evolution from participant to planner marked a turning point in his life. He was no longer simply a member of the mafia, he was becoming a model for a new kind of leadership. One rooted in administration rather than aggression, in distance rather than familiarity. It was a model that mirrored legitimate corporate structures, blurring the line between crime and commerce even further. As he continued to rise, Castellano's confidence in this model hardened into conviction. He believed he had found a safer way to rule, a way that minimized personal risk while maximizing control. He trusted procedures, hierarchies, and calculations more than instincts or relationships. In doing so, he built an empire that appeared stable, efficient, and insulated. But beneath this efficiency lay a subtle vulnerability. By separating himself from the streets, Castellano also separated himself from the emotions and loyalties that bound his organization together. He could measure profits and losses, but resentment was harder to quantify. Ambition did not appear on balance sheets. The human element, which he deliberately kept at a distance, was quietly accumulating weight. For now, though, Castellano's approach seemed unassailable. He was rising steadily, supported by powerful allies and shielded by his own caution. He had become the anti-street gangster, a man who ruled not through presence, but through absence. And in that absence, the seeds of both his dominance and his eventual undoing were already taking root. As Paul Castellano's reputation for discipline and reliability grew, it began to align almost perfectly with the values of one man whose influence loomed over the entire American mafia. Carlo Gambino was not impressed by noise or theatrics. He valued longevity, order, and an instinct for survival that favored caution over confrontation. In Castellano, Gambino saw something familiar, a temperament shaped by restraint, patience, and an understanding that power was most effective when exercised quietly. Their connection was not accidental, nor was it merely professional. It was reinforced by blood, tradition, and a shared belief in control. Gambino had risen through decades of shifting alliances and violent transitions, learning firsthand how quickly a careless leader could bring ruin upon an entire organization. By the time he reached the height of his power, he was focused not on expansion but on preservation. Stability mattered more than ambition. Predictability mattered more than charisma. Castellano's methodical approach fit seamlessly into this vision. He was not impulsive, he did not draw attention, and he understood that the mafia, like any institution, survived best when its internal machinery ran smoothly. Their relationship deepened gradually. Castellano was never treated as a flashy protégé or public heir. Instead, Gambino tested him quietly, assigning responsibilities that required judgment rather than force. Castellano handled complex business arrangements, managed disputes that could have escalated into violence, and oversaw operations that demanded discretion. Each success reinforced Gambino's confidence in him. Castellano proved, time and again, that he could be trusted with sensitive matters. What distinguished Castellano from other rising figures was his understanding of boundaries. He did not overstep. He did not challenge authority or seek recognition. He understood the importance of waiting, of allowing trust to grow naturally. This patience impressed Gambino deeply. In a world where ambition often announced itself loudly, Castellano's restraint was rare and valuable. As Castellano's role expanded, so did his exposure to the inner workings of the Gambino family. He was present for discussions that shaped policy rather than reaction. He learned how decisions were weighed, how alliances were maintained, and how conflicts were diffused before they reached the streets. These lessons reinforced his belief that leadership was less about presence and more about perception. A boss did not need to be everywhere, he needed to be felt everywhere. Gambino, for his part, began to see Castellano not just as a capable subordinate but as a possible future steward of the family. This was not a decision made lightly. Succession in the mafia was often violent, unpredictable, and contested. Choosing a successor meant choosing the future character of the organization. Gambino's preference for Castellano reflected his desire to protect the family from unnecessary risk. He believed Castellano's corporate mindset could shield the organization from law enforcement and internal chaos alike. However, this quiet grooming did not go unnoticed. Others within the family began to sense Castellano's rising influence. Some accepted it as a natural outcome of his family ties and competence. Others viewed it with suspicion. Street-level captains, who had earned their positions through years of dangerous work, resented the idea that leadership could be inherited or administratively achieved. To them, Castellano represented a shift away from tradition, a move toward management over merit. Gambino was aware of these tensions, but he believed they could be managed. He relied heavily on his underboss, Neil Delacroce, to maintain loyalty among the street crews. Delacroce was respected, approachable, and deeply connected to the soldiers who carried out the daily work of the family. Together, Gambino believed, Castellano and Delacroce could balance each other, one handling the business, the other maintaining the street. This dual structure allowed Castellano to continue his ascent without directly confronting resistance. He operated within Gambino's protective shadow, gaining authority while avoiding open conflict. He did not seek to replace the existing culture immediately. Instead, he positioned himself as a complement to it. His focus remained on profitability and structure, while others maintained the traditional rituals of loyalty and respect. During this period, Castellano refined his leadership philosophy further. He observed how Gambino managed power not through fear but through consistency. Decisions were deliberate, rarely impulsive. Punishments were measured. Rewards were calculated. Castellano absorbed these methods and adapted them to his own temperament. Where Gambino was naturally charismatic in his own quiet way, Castellano relied more heavily on distance. He believed authority was enhanced by formality. As Gambino's health began to decline in the early 1970s, questions of succession grew more pressing. Castellano's name was rarely spoken openly, but it hovered in the background of every serious conversation. Gambino did not announce his intentions publicly. He preferred to let events unfold according to his design, minimizing disruption. Castellano continued to fulfill his duties without change in demeanor, never appearing eager or entitled. When Gambino finally made his decision, it reflected his deepest instincts. He chose Castellano not because he was beloved, but because he was predictable. In a world defined by volatility, predictability was priceless. Gambino believed Castellano would preserve the family's wealth, maintain its alliances, and avoid the reckless behavior that attracted law enforcement. He trusted Castellano to think in decades rather than moments. This decision, however, carried consequences Gambino may have underestimated. By favoring Castellano, he reinforced the perception that lineage and business acumen mattered more than street loyalty. This created quiet resentment among those who felt bypassed. They did not challenge Gambino directly, his authority was unquestioned, but they stored their grievances for the future. For Castellano, the weight of Gambino's trust was both an honor and a burden. He understood the responsibility he was being given. He also understood the expectations that came with it. He did not attempt to bridge the emotional gap with his critics. Instead, he doubled down on his belief that authority should not seek approval. He trusted the structure Gambino had built and believed he could maintain it through discipline alone. As the era of Carlo Gambino neared its end, Castellano stood poised at the threshold of ultimate power. He had been groomed not through spectacle, but through silence. He had learned from a master who valued survival above all else. Yet the very qualities that earned Gambino's trust were already sowing division within the family. Castellano was inheriting not only an empire, but also the fault lines that ran beneath it. The shadow of Carlo Gambino had protected him, guided him, and elevated him. Soon, that shadow would disappear, leaving Castellano exposed to the full weight of leadership. And when that moment came, he would discover that being chosen was not the same as being accepted. As Paul Castellano's influence solidified within the Gambino organization, his vision for how the mafia should operate became increasingly clear. He did not see chaos as strength, nor violence as a badge of honor. To him, disorder was inefficient, and inefficiency invited danger. The American mafia, in his view, had reached a point where survival depended on evolution. The days of constant street battles and public intimidation were liabilities. What mattered now was stability, predictability, and steady profit. Castellano believed that crime, like any enterprise, functioned best when it resembled a corporation. This philosophy reshaped the way the Gambino family conducted its business. Castellano pushed operations toward industries that blended seamlessly with legitimate commerce. Construction, trucking, waste management, and food distribution offered endless opportunities for influence without spectacle. These sectors allowed for long-term contracts, recurring revenue, and layers of insulation from direct criminal exposure. Money could be earned quietly, laundered efficiently, and reinvested without drawing attention. One of Castellano's greatest strengths was his understanding of how legal frameworks could be manipulated without openly violating them. He encouraged arrangements that technically appeared lawful while being controlled through intimidation and influence behind the scenes. Unions were guided rather than threatened. Contractors complied because it was easier than resisting. Disputes were settled through negotiation, not gunfire. This reduced visibility made law enforcement's job more difficult and allowed operations to flourish undisturbed. Meetings under Castellano's guidance became more formal, more structured. Agendas replaced casual conversation. Expectations were clearly outlined. Revenue streams were tracked meticulously. He expected reports, not excuses. This managerial style was foreign to many in the organization, but it produced results. Profits increased, and conflicts decreased. The family grew wealthier even as it appeared quieter. Yet this transformation was not universally welcomed. Street-level soldiers and captains, whose identities were forged through risk and loyalty, felt increasingly marginalized. Their skills, intimidation, enforcement, and presence, were less valued in a system that prioritized contracts and connections. To them, Castellano's corporate approach felt like a rejection of tradition. They feared becoming expendable, replaced by paperwork and distant oversight. Castellano was aware of this tension but considered it a necessary adjustment. He believed that sentimentality had no place in leadership. The organization existed to generate profit and protect itself. Those who adapted would thrive. Those who clung to outdated methods would be left behind. He did not attempt to soften this message. In his mind, clarity was kinder than compromise. This emphasis on order extended to discipline. Castellano was intolerant of behavior that threatened stability. Drug trafficking, in particular, was a concern. He viewed narcotics as a magnet for law enforcement and a source of unpredictable violence. While the mafia's stance on drugs was often contradictory in practice, Castellano publicly opposed it, believing that short-term gains were not worth long-term risk. His hardline position reinforced his image as a cautious, rule-driven leader. Under his influence, the Gambino family became increasingly stratified. Lines between management and enforcement sharpened. Castellano remained insulated from daily street activity, relying on intermediaries to enforce policy. This reduced his exposure but also limited his understanding of street-level sentiment. Information traveled upward filtered through layers, losing nuance along the way. Castellano trusted these systems, believing that structure minimized error. Financial success reinforced his confidence. The family's reach expanded quietly, embedded in the city's infrastructure. Construction projects rose across New York with Gambino influence woven into contracts and labor agreements. Money flowed steadily, reinforcing Castellano's belief that he was steering the organization toward a safer future. To him, visibility was the enemy, and invisibility was victory. However, this success came at a cost. Castellano's distance created a vacuum of personal connection. Soldiers rarely saw him. Captains interacted with him formally, not familiarly. Decisions were delivered as directives, not discussions. Loyalty became transactional rather than emotional. While fear and profit maintained compliance, they did not inspire devotion. In private, Castellano justified this approach as realism. He believed that affection clouded judgment and invited betrayal. By keeping relationships formal, he reduced the risk of personal disappointment. He trusted systems because systems did not lie, did not gossip, and did not act on impulse. This mindset shaped every aspect of his leadership. Yet organizations are not machines. They are networks of people, each with ambitions, fears, and loyalties that cannot be fully quantified. Castellano's corporate mafia functioned efficiently on paper, but beneath the surface, dissatisfaction simmered. Men who had built their lives around personal loyalty felt increasingly disconnected from the top. They followed orders, but their hearts were elsewhere. Law enforcement, meanwhile, adapted. As violence decreased, investigations shifted toward financial crimes, wiretaps, and surveillance. Castellano's emphasis on business created paper trails, however carefully managed. His avoidance of street noise did not make the organization invisible, it made it traceable. Slowly, federal attention began to align with the very systems Castellano relied upon. Still, for a time, his model appeared unassailable. The Gambino family prospered. Other families took notice. Some admired Castellano's restraint and sought to emulate aspects of his approach. The mafia, once defined by chaos, was quietly professionalizing under leaders like him. It seemed like evolution. Castellano took pride in this transformation. He believed he was safeguarding the future, modernizing an old institution to survive in a changing world. He trusted logic over instinct, order over tradition. And in doing so, he placed his faith in a structure that left little room for dissent. But as the family grew wealthier, the emotional distance between leadership and soldiers widened. Castellano's empire was stable, but it was also brittle. It relied on compliance rather than connection. And while fear could maintain order, it could not prevent ambition. The corporate mafia Castellano built was efficient, profitable, and quiet. It was also deeply impersonal. And as history would later reveal, impersonal power, when challenged, often collapses not with chaos, but with precision. When Carlo Gambino died in October of 1976, the event passed without spectacle, just as he would have preferred. There were no dramatic announcements, no public displays of succession. To the outside world, little seemed to change. Yet within the hidden structure of the mafia, the shift was monumental. One era had ended quietly, and another was about to begin under a man whose leadership style would redefine the Gambino family in ways few fully understood at the time. Paul Castellano assumed control not through a violent struggle or a contested claim, but through designation. Gambino had chosen him carefully, believing that continuity mattered more than popularity. This decision, however, challenged long-standing traditions. Typically, succession favored men who had earned their authority on the streets, who had bled alongside their crews and shared in the daily risks of enforcement. Castellano had not done this. His power derived from lineage, trust, and administrative competence. For many, this distinction was unsettling. The announcement of Castellano's ascension was restrained, delivered through established channels rather than public ceremony. Captains were informed, expectations were set, and operations continued. Outwardly, the family accepted the transition. Inwardly, tension grew. Men who had expected Neil Delacroce to be named boss instead felt overlooked. Delacroce was respected, accessible, and deeply connected to the soldiers. He embodied the traditional mafia ideal. Castellano, by contrast, represented a shift toward detachment and formality. Castellano was acutely aware of this divide. His response was not to seek reconciliation, but to reinforce structure. He elevated Delacroce to underboss, believing this arrangement would balance authority and maintain loyalty among the street crews. On paper, it was a logical solution. In practice, it created two centers of gravity within the family. Castellano handled business from a distance, while Delacroce remained embedded in the street culture. The arrangement preserved order, but it also institutionalized division. From the outset, Castellano ruled with an emphasis on hierarchy. He expected deference and adherence to protocol. Meetings became more formal. Communication was channeled through intermediaries. Access to the boss was limited. This reinforced his authority but also increased his isolation. He believed that a leader's distance commanded respect. Familiarity, in his view, weakened discipline. His early decisions reflected his priorities. He focused on protecting revenue streams, tightening oversight of businesses, and minimizing exposure to law enforcement. Violence was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. He reiterated his opposition to drug trafficking, viewing it as a destabilizing influence. These policies aligned with his long-term vision but clashed with the ambitions of those seeking rapid profit. The physical manifestation of Castellano's leadership soon became apparent. He moved further away from the city's core, eventually establishing himself in a grand mansion on Staten Island. To him, the residence symbolized success and security. To others, it symbolized separation. The distance between the boss and the streets became literal as well as metaphorical. Soldiers rarely saw him. His presence was felt through directives rather than interaction. This separation fueled resentment. Many captains believed Castellano did not understand the realities they faced. They felt he demanded results without sharing risk. Loyalty, once rooted in shared hardship, began to feel one-sided. While Castellano believed structure ensured stability, others perceived indifference. Law enforcement, meanwhile, took note of the transition. Castellano's ascension marked a continuation of Gambino's low-visibility approach, but his corporate focus created new investigative avenues. Financial records, contracts, and meetings became targets for surveillance. The family's quiet efficiency made it harder to detect violence, but easier to trace money. Internally, Castellano's authority remained unchallenged, but not unquestioned. His reliance on Delacroce to maintain street loyalty was both a strength and a vulnerability. As long as Delacroce lived, the balance held. Castellano trusted this arrangement, believing that formal hierarchy could contain dissent. He underestimated the emotional dynamics at play. Respect enforced by structure is not the same as respect earned through connection. Castellano's leadership style demanded obedience, not affection. While this ensured compliance, it did not inspire devotion. Ambition, once restrained by loyalty, began to look for opportunity. Castellano interpreted obedience as success. He believed that as long as operations ran smoothly and profits flowed, his authority was secure. He did not see the quiet dissatisfaction as a threat. In his mind, dissent without action was manageable. He trusted that fear of consequences would deter rebellion. Yet power transitions are rarely judged by logic alone. They are shaped by perception, tradition, and emotion. Castellano's ascension disrupted the unwritten rules of mafia culture. By prioritizing business acumen over street credibility, he altered the organization's identity. This shift created a fault line that would widen over time. As the months passed, Castellano settled into his role with confidence. He believed he was safeguarding the family's future, preserving Gambino's legacy through modernization. He trusted the systems he put in place and the hierarchy that supported them. He did not seek to be loved. He sought to be effective. But beneath the surface, alliances were shifting. Men who felt excluded from the new order began to question their place within it. They did not challenge Castellano openly, but they remembered the slight. They waited. The crown had passed quietly, but its weight was immense. Castellano now stood at the pinnacle of power, insulated by structure and distance. He believed this insulation made him untouchable. He did not yet realize that isolation, while protecting him from immediate threats, was also cutting him off from the warnings that might have saved him. In inheriting the Gambino family, Castellano had inherited not only wealth and influence, but also a culture that resisted change. His reign began with order and calm, but the seeds of conflict were already planted. And as history would soon reveal, the quietest transitions often carry the loudest consequences. High above the narrow streets and aging row houses where the Gambino family had once built its reputation, a mansion stood on the hill in Staten Island, removed from the noise and closeness of the city. The neighborhood was quiet, orderly, and distant from the chaos of Manhattan and Brooklyn. From its elevated position, the house seemed less like a home and more like a statement. For Paul Castellano, it represented success, security, and control. For many within his organization, it became a symbol of separation. The mansion on Toad Hill was expansive, modern, and meticulously maintained. Long driveways replaced crowded sidewalks. Gates and hedges ensured privacy. Inside, rooms were spacious and carefully arranged, reflecting Castellano's preference for order and formality. Every detail conveyed intention. This was not a place for casual gatherings or spontaneous visits. Access was limited, appointments were scheduled, and interactions were measured. Castellano ruled from behind walls, both physical and psychological. He believed this distance was necessary. After years of observing how proximity invited risk, he concluded that separation offered protection. The streets were unpredictable, filled with informants, rival ambitions, and federal surveillance. By removing himself from that environment, Castellano felt he could think clearly, plan effectively, and reduce exposure. The mansion was not just a residence, it was a strategic decision. Yet symbolism matters deeply in organizations built on perception. The mafia had long valued the idea that a boss was accessible, present, and grounded in the same world as his soldiers. Castellano's retreat to Staten Island disrupted this tradition. To the men who navigated danger daily, the mansion felt like an ivory tower. It reinforced the belief that Castellano had insulated himself from the consequences of his decisions. Meetings at the mansion were formal affairs. Attendees arrived with caution, aware of surveillance risks and the seriousness of the setting. Conversations were structured, focused on business, and free of warmth. Castellano did not entertain casual discussion. He listened, responded, and dismissed. This efficiency impressed some, but alienated others. The absence of informal bonding left little room for loyalty to deepen. Castellano was comfortable in this environment. It aligned with his temperament. He valued predictability, routine, and control. From the mansion, he could oversee operations without immersion. He trusted reports and intermediaries, believing that information traveled best through defined channels. He did not see the need to witness street conditions firsthand. In his mind, delegation was not neglect, it was management. However, this reliance on filtered information came with risks. Messages softened as they moved upward. Problems were minimized to avoid displeasing the boss. Dissatisfaction rarely reached him in its raw form. Castellano believed order prevailed because he saw no evidence to the contrary. He mistook silence for stability. The mansion also became a focal point for resentment. Soldiers and captains spoke quietly about the contrast between their lives and his. They navigated arrests, violence, and constant pressure, while Castellano lived in comfort. The perception of inequality eroded morale. Loyalty began to feel transactional, dependent on profit rather than respect. Castellano was aware of these criticisms but dismissed them as emotional reactions. He believed that leadership required sacrifice, and in his mind, he had sacrificed comfort earlier in life to build the organization. Now, he felt entitled to security. He did not believe that sharing hardship was necessary to command obedience. Authority, he believed, flowed from position, not proximity. The physical distance also affected his relationship with other leaders. Visits to the mansion were infrequent, and Castellano rarely traveled to traditional meeting places. This limited informal communication, the kind that often reveals unspoken tensions. Decisions became top-down, delivered without discussion. While this streamlined operations, it reduced feedback. Law enforcement took notice of the mansion as well. Its prominence made it a landmark. Surveillance intensified, with agents monitoring arrivals and departures. Castellano believed his precautions were sufficient, but the very act of centralizing leadership in one location created predictability. The fortress was visible, even if its activities were hidden. Despite these concerns, Castellano remained committed to his approach. He believed that a boss should not be consumed by the daily grind. He saw himself as a strategist, not an enforcer. The mansion allowed him to maintain emotional distance, which he considered essential. He did not want friendships clouding his judgment. Decisions, in his view, should be made without sentiment. This philosophy extended to his personal life. Castellano maintained strict routines, separating family from business. Even within his home, boundaries were clear. The house was quiet, controlled, and disciplined. Chaos was not tolerated. This environment reinforced his sense of order but also deepened his isolation. As time passed, the mansion became more than a symbol of success, it became a dividing line. On one side stood Castellano, secure and removed. On the other stood the street, restless and increasingly disconnected. The distance between them grew not only in miles but in understanding. Castellano believed that power was safest when it was distant. He believed that trust was a vulnerability. The mansion embodied these beliefs perfectly. It was strong, secure, and silent. Yet silence can conceal more than peace. It can hide resentment, ambition, and resolve. In choosing isolation, Castellano protected himself from immediate threats but blinded himself to long-term ones. The walls that kept danger out also kept warning signs away. From his elevated position, the world below appeared orderly. He did not see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The mansion on Toad Hill stood as a testament to Castellano's vision, a corporate mafia ruled from a quiet fortress. But it also stood as a reminder that power, when removed from the people it governs, becomes fragile. And as history would show, no wall is high enough to protect a leader who no longer hears the streets. As Paul Castellano settled deeper into his role as boss, his method of control became increasingly defined by distance, discipline, and an unwavering insistence on hierarchy. He did not rule through camaraderie or shared experience. Instead, he ruled through expectation. Orders were not suggestions. They were instructions, delivered calmly and without room for interpretation. Castellano believed that clarity prevented chaos, and that fear of consequences was a more reliable motivator than affection. Within the Gambino family, his leadership created an atmosphere of restraint. Meetings were formal, brief, and purposeful. Men arrived prepared, aware that hesitation or disorganization would not be tolerated. Castellano valued efficiency above all else. He listened carefully, but he did not invite debate. Decisions, once made, were final. This style reduced internal disputes, but it also discouraged initiative. People learned to wait rather than contribute. Castellano rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. His authority came from his position and from the knowledge that disobedience carried severe consequences. Punishments were calculated and delivered without emotion. There were no dramatic displays of anger, no impulsive reactions. This emotional detachment made him unpredictable in a different way. Men could not appeal to his sympathy, because he did not operate on sympathy. He operated on principle. Trust, in Castellano's world, was conditional and limited. He believed that most betrayals were born from familiarity. The closer people became, the more likely they were to disappoint. As a result, he kept his circle small and his relationships formal. Information was compartmentalized. No one knew more than they needed to. Castellano believed this minimized risk. If one part of the organization failed, the rest could continue. This approach, however, created an environment where loyalty was rooted in fear rather than respect. Men followed orders because they had to, not because they wanted to. They complied because defiance was dangerous, not because they believed in the vision. Castellano saw this as discipline. Others saw it as coldness. The absence of warmth was felt most strongly among the street crews. These men lived under constant pressure, law enforcement, rival factions, and the ever-present risk of violence. Historically, they relied on personal bonds with leadership for reassurance and protection. Castellano offered neither. He expected results, not explanations. Success was rewarded, but recognition was minimal. Failure was punished swiftly. Over time, this dynamic eroded morale. Soldiers felt interchangeable, valued only for their output. While profits flowed upward, gratitude rarely flowed downward. Castellano believed this was the natural order of things. In his view, the organization existed to serve its leadership, not the other way around. Individual feelings were irrelevant to collective success. Castellano's distrust extended even to those closest to him. He relied heavily on intermediaries to relay information, creating layers between himself and the streets. This insulated him but also distorted reality. Problems were often softened before reaching him. Bad news was delayed or minimized. Castellano interpreted this filtered calm as evidence that his system was working. He also expected unwavering obedience to rules, particularly regarding conduct that attracted attention. Drug trafficking, unauthorized violence, and public displays of wealth were strictly forbidden. Castellano believed that discipline protected everyone. Those who violated these rules were seen not as rebels, but as threats to the entire organization. Punishments were severe, reinforcing his reputation as uncompromising. Yet rules without dialogue can breed resentment. Many felt that Castellano's expectations were unrealistic given the realities of street life. Enforcement often required flexibility, improvisation, and emotional intelligence. Castellano's rigid framework left little room for nuance. When conflicts arose, solutions were imposed from above rather than developed collaboratively. This rigidity was compounded by his physical absence. Castellano rarely appeared in the neighborhoods where his orders were executed. His understanding of street conditions was second-hand. This disconnect made some of his directives seem out of touch. Frustration grew quietly, expressed only in private conversations among trusted peers. Despite these undercurrents, Castellano remained confident. He equated order with success. As long as operations ran smoothly and profits remained strong, he believed his leadership was justified. He dismissed dissent as noise, unworthy of consideration. In his mind, leadership was not a popularity contest. The gap between Castellano and his organization widened gradually. Each formal meeting, each impersonal directive, reinforced the perception that he was distant and unapproachable. Loyalty became brittle, dependent on fear and financial incentive rather than shared identity. Castellano trusted that fear would endure. However, fear has limits. It suppresses action, but it also suppresses communication. Men stopped bringing concerns to him. They stopped warning him of brewing discontent. Castellano mistook this silence for stability, unaware that it was masking growing ambition among those who felt unheard. His leadership style also affected succession planning. Castellano did not cultivate future leaders through mentorship. He believed authority should be earned through results, not guidance. This left a vacuum of loyalty at the upper levels. Potential successors were not invested in preserving his vision, they were invested in replacing it. As time passed, Castellano's isolation deepened. The systems he trusted became walls. The hierarchy he enforced became rigid. His insistence on distance protected him from immediate threats but left him vulnerable to long-term ones. He had built an organization that functioned efficiently but lacked emotional cohesion. In the quiet of his mansion, Castellano believed he was in control. He reviewed reports, made decisions, and enforced rules. He did not see the frustration accumulating below. He did not hear the whispers growing louder in rooms he never entered. He trusted his system because it was logical. But leadership is not sustained by logic alone. It requires trust, communication, and an understanding of human motivation. Castellano had deliberately minimized these elements, believing them to be liabilities. In doing so, he created an environment where obedience replaced loyalty, and fear replaced respect. This was the paradox of his rule. The more he tightened control, the more disconnected he became. And while his authority appeared absolute, it rested on a foundation that was quietly eroding. The boss who trusted no one had built a system where, increasingly, no one truly trusted him. Within the Gambino family, the structure that emerged under Paul Castellano was balanced on an uneasy duality. On paper, authority flowed cleanly from the top, reinforced by hierarchy and protocol. In reality, power was divided between two very different worlds. One was Castellano's realm of contracts, financial oversight, and insulated decision-making. The other belonged to Neil Delacroce, a man whose presence on the streets anchored loyalty and tradition. Together, they held the family together. Separately, they represented a growing divide. Neil Delacroce was everything Castellano was not. He was accessible, familiar, and deeply respected by the soldiers and captains who navigated daily risk. He had earned his position through years of visible commitment, enforcing rules side by side with his men. He knew their families, their struggles, and their ambitions. When problems arose, Delacroce listened before he acted. His authority came not just from fear, but from trust. Castellano understood Delacroce's value and relied on him heavily. Elevating him to underboss was a strategic move, designed to maintain balance and prevent rebellion. Castellano believed that by allowing Delacroce to manage street operations, he could focus on business without sacrificing loyalty. In theory, it was an elegant solution. In practice, it created two centers of gravity within the same organization. Street crews gravitated naturally toward Delacroce. He represented continuity, a link to the mafia's past. Castellano, by contrast, was seen as distant and corporate. Men followed his orders, but their allegiance often lay with Delacroce. This unspoken loyalty shaped behavior. Information flowed more freely to the underboss than to the boss. Problems were addressed informally through Delacroix rather than formally through Castellano. This dynamic was not lost on Castellano. He accepted it as a necessary compromise. He believed that structure could contain sentiment. As long as Delacroix remained loyal, the system would hold. Castellano trusted Delacroix's discipline and history. He did not believe Delacroix would ever challenge him directly. Yet the existence of two power centers subtly undermined Castellano's authority. Captains learned to navigate the divide, aligning themselves strategically. When Castellano's directives felt out of touch, they sought understanding from Delacroix. When enforcement was required, Delacroix's word carried more emotional weight. Castellano's authority was respected, but Delacroix was felt. This imbalance grew more pronounced as Castellano continued to distance himself from the streets. His reliance on formal channels limited his visibility into daily operations. Delacroix, meanwhile, remained embedded, absorbing the mood of the organization. He heard grievances, sensed ambition, and understood the pressures his men faced. Castellano received reports, Delacroix received confessions. The contrast in leadership styles created an identity split within the family. Castellano's followers believed in modernization, efficiency, and insulation. Delacroix's supporters believed in tradition, loyalty, and shared risk. While open conflict was avoided, the tension was constant. Each side viewed the other with a mix of respect and suspicion. Law enforcement pressure intensified this divide. As investigations increased, Castellano pushed for stricter discipline and reduced visibility. Delacroix, understanding the realities of the street, advocated flexibility. These differences occasionally surfaced in private disagreements. Castellano valued rules. Delacroix valued relationships. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but their coexistence was fragile. Castellano's trust in Delacroix was genuine, but limited. He did not share everything with him. Information remained compartmentalized. Castellano believed this protected him. Delacroix accepted this arrangement outwardly, but he understood its implications. He knew that Castellano did not fully trust anyone. This knowledge shaped his interactions, reinforcing his role as a buffer rather than a partner. For the soldiers, Delacroix became the face of leadership. Castellano was a distant authority figure, while Delacroix was present and engaged. This did not immediately threaten Castellano's position, but it weakened his emotional hold on the organization. Loyalty, once personal, became divided. As years passed, Delacroix's health began to decline. Illness reduced his ability to maintain constant presence. Castellano assumed the balance would hold regardless. He underestimated how much of the family's cohesion depended on Delacroix's influence. Without him, the fault line would widen. Whispers began among younger captains. They questioned whether Castellano understood them. They compared his detachment with Delacroix's accessibility. Ambition grew quietly, fueled by frustration. Castellano, insulated by hierarchy, did not hear these conversations. He believed that authority enforced by structure was sufficient. The dual structure that once preserved peace now carried risk. Castellano's rule depended heavily on Delacroix's mediation. As Delacroix weakened, Castellano's isolation became more apparent. The balance he relied upon was temporary, but he treated it as permanent. In the silence between meetings, alliances shifted. Men calculated futures without Delacroix. Castellano remained confident in his system, unaware that the emotional center of the family was drifting away from him. The Gambino family was still unified, but the unity was conditional. It rested on the presence of a man who bridged two worlds. As that bridge began to crumble, the divide it concealed grew wider, setting the stage for a reckoning that Castellano could neither see nor prevent. John Gotti did not enter the Gambino family quietly, even when he tried. From the beginning, his presence carried energy that contrasted sharply with Paul Castellano's controlled, distant authority. Where Castellano believed in restraint, Gotti thrived on visibility. Where Castellano trusted systems, Gotti trusted instinct and loyalty. The clash between these two philosophies was inevitable, long before it became personal. Gotti rose through the ranks in the streets of Brooklyn, particularly in the Ozone Park area, where reputation mattered as much as results. He was charismatic, fearless, and deeply connected to his crew. Men followed him not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. Gotti understood the emotional currency of leadership. He knew how to inspire confidence, how to make people feel valued, and how to command attention without demanding it. These traits made him popular, and popularity, in Castellano's world, was dangerous. Castellano viewed Gotti with suspicion from the outset. To him, Gotti represented unpredictability. His flashy style, expensive suits, and willingness to be seen violated Castellano's core principle of invisibility. Gotti attracted attention, not only from admirers but from law enforcement. Castellano believed this recklessness threatened the entire organization. He saw Gotti not as a rising star, but as a liability. The tension between them deepened as Gotti's influence grew. Despite Castellano's efforts to limit visibility, Gotti's reputation continued to expand. He delivered results on the street, enforced discipline, and maintained loyalty. His crew was efficient and aggressive, generating profits and enforcing order. Castellano could not ignore this success, but he resented the methods. Castellano's leadership style left little room for personalities like Gotti. Orders flowed downward, not upward. Castellano expected compliance without question. Gotti, accustomed to autonomy and respect, chafed under this rigidity. He did not openly challenge Castellano, but his actions often tested boundaries. Each display of independence reinforced Castellano's belief that Gotti could not be trusted. Neil Delacroix played a critical role in mediating this relationship. Delacroix respected Gotti and understood his value. He also understood Castellano's concerns. Acting as a buffer, Delacroix shielded Gotti from Castellano's harsher judgments while encouraging restraint. As long as Delacroix remained strong, this balance held. Castellano's distrust of Gotti intensified with specific incidents. When members of Gotti's crew were implicated in activities Castellano forbade, particularly drug trafficking, suspicion hardened into resentment. Castellano viewed these violations as personal defiance. He believed that Gotti either could not control his men or chose not to. Either explanation was unacceptable. Gotti, meanwhile, felt increasingly marginalized. He saw Castellano living in luxury, far removed from street realities, while demanding obedience without engagement. Gotti believed leadership required presence. He interpreted Castellano's distance as arrogance. This perception fueled his ambition. He began to imagine alternative futures for the family, futures where leadership was visible and loyal to the streets. Despite this, Gotti remained cautious. Castellano's power was absolute. Open defiance would be fatal. Gotti waited, building alliances quietly. He understood that timing mattered more than boldness. He watched Castellano's relationships, noting the growing isolation and reliance on intermediaries. Castellano underestimated Gotti's patience. He believed that structure could contain ambition. He saw Gotti as a problem that could be managed through discipline and surveillance. He did not see him as a threat to his position. Castellano trusted his hierarchy to neutralize individual personalities. The contrast between the two men became symbolic within the organization. Castellano represented the future he envisioned, quiet, corporate, insulated. Gotti represented the past many missed, personal, bold, and emotionally connected. Soldiers and captains compared them privately, measuring what they valued more. Castellano did not hear these conversations. Gotti lived within them. As law enforcement pressure increased, Castellano's intolerance for visibility sharpened. He viewed Gotti's behavior as increasingly dangerous. Discussions of potential punishment began to surface within Castellano's inner circle. Gotti sensed the shift. He understood that his survival depended on more than street loyalty. It depended on the balance of power above him. Delacroix's declining health intensified the tension. Gotti knew that Delacroix was his primary protector. Without him, Castellano's restraint might disappear. Castellano, meanwhile, believed that removing Delacroix from the equation would simplify governance. He did not fully grasp how much Delacroix's presence restrained ambition. The relationship between Castellano and Gotti was never one of open conflict. It was a quiet standoff, shaped by mistrust and incompatible worldviews. Each man believed the other endangered the family. Each believed his own approach was the only path to survival. As the years passed, this unspoken rivalry hardened. Castellano's suspicion became resolve. Gotti's resentment became calculation. The organization, caught between them, felt the tension but remained outwardly stable. In the calm before the storm, both men believed time was on their side. Castellano trusted his systems. Gotti trusted loyalty. Neither fully understood how close the balance was to collapse. By the early 1980s, the pressure surrounding Paul Castellano was no longer abstract or distant. It had shape, sound, and persistence. It arrived in the form of surveillance vans parked too long on familiar streets, unfamiliar faces lingering near known meeting places, and the quiet awareness that conversations might no longer belong only to the people having them. Law enforcement had evolved, and Castellano understood this better than most. The era of informants alone was giving way to technology, long-term investigations, and patience that matched his own. Castellano had always believed that minimizing violence reduced attention, but attention was finding him anyway. Federal authorities were no longer focused solely on murders and street-level crimes. They were following money, patterns, and organizational structures. The very corporate efficiency Castellano prized was becoming a roadmap for investigators. Businesses that appeared legitimate on the surface were being examined from within. Contracts were traced. Relationships were mapped. Silence, once protective, now invited deeper scrutiny. Wiretaps became Castellano's greatest concern. He understood that words, once spoken, could be captured, replayed, and interpreted without context. This fear reshaped his behavior. Conversations grew shorter. Meetings were reduced in frequency. Sensitive topics were avoided altogether unless absolutely necessary. Castellano believed that the safest words were the ones never spoken. His already distant leadership style hardened further under this pressure. He tightened his inner circle, relying on fewer intermediaries and trusting only those who had proven themselves over decades. Even then, trust was conditional. Castellano assumed that anyone could be compromised. This belief isolated him further, but he considered it a necessary defense. In his mind, paranoia was not weakness, it was adaptation. The introduction of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, loomed heavily over his thinking. Castellano understood its implications more clearly than many of his peers. RICO threatened not just individuals, but entire organizations. It allowed prosecutors to connect disparate crimes into a single narrative, targeting leadership rather than just foot soldiers. Castellano realized that his position at the top made him uniquely vulnerable. In response, he emphasized compartmentalization even more aggressively. No one was allowed to know more than necessary. Operations were segmented. Communication channels were narrowed. Castellano believed that if one part of the organization fell, the rest could survive. This strategy mirrored corporate risk management, but it also reduced transparency within his own ranks. For street-level members, this environment felt increasingly restrictive. They were expected to generate profits without clarity, to obey orders without explanation. Castellano's caution translated into silence from above. While he believed this protected everyone, others interpreted it as indifference. The gap between leadership and execution widened further. Castellano's personal routines changed as well. He avoided predictable schedules when possible, though his reliance on structured habits made complete unpredictability difficult. He became more guarded, more inward. Even within his own home, he maintained a heightened awareness of vulnerability. The sense of being watched never fully receded. Law enforcement pressure also affected Castellano's relationships within the mafia hierarchy. Meetings with other family leaders were conducted cautiously, often through intermediaries. Castellano preferred indirect communication to reduce exposure. This reduced collaboration and fostered misunderstanding. Alliances that once relied on trust now relied on formality. Despite these precautions, Castellano could not escape the reality that his organization was under intense scrutiny. Investigators were patient. They listened, recorded, and waited. Castellano sensed this patience and responded with his own, tightening control, delaying decisions, and minimizing movement. He believed that time favored those who stayed quiet. Yet pressure changes people. Castellano's already rigid leadership became increasingly inflexible. He tolerated no deviation from protocol. Mistakes that might once have been forgiven were now punished harshly. He believed that discipline was the only defense against infiltration. This zero-tolerance approach increased fear but also resentment. Those closest to him noticed the change. Castellano spoke less, trusted less, and withdrew further into isolation. His mansion became both sanctuary and prison. From its quiet rooms, he reviewed reports and made decisions, but he rarely ventured into the environments those decisions affected. He believed that distance reduced risk. He did not see how it reduced awareness. For ambitious figures like John Gotti, this environment was both threatening and revealing. Castellano's fear of exposure translated into rigidity, and rigidity created opportunity. Gotti observed how pressure amplified Castellano's weaknesses, his distrust, his distance, his reliance on systems over people. Gotti understood that leadership under siege often turns inward, losing touch with those it commands. Castellano, however, interpreted his own behavior as strength. He believed he was outlasting the investigation. He trusted that by saying less and doing less publicly, he could starve law enforcement of evidence. He did not consider how silence might be filled by others, how decisions deferred might be replaced by decisions made elsewhere. The constant pressure also reinforced Castellano's belief that visibility was fatal. He grew increasingly intolerant of anyone who attracted attention. Flashy behavior, public appearances, and reckless actions were seen as direct threats. This further strained his relationship with figures like Gotti, whose style contradicted everything Castellano believed was necessary for survival. Internally, the organization adapted unevenly. Some embraced Castellano's caution, believing it protected them. Others felt constrained, frustrated by rules that limited opportunity. The sense of shared purpose weakened. Survival became individual rather than collective. Castellano trusted that fear of law enforcement would unify the family. Instead, it exposed fractures. Under pressure, loyalty becomes tested. Castellano's leadership demanded obedience, but obedience under stress does not always translate to loyalty. It can instead breed calculation. As investigations continued, Castellano remained focused on control. He believed that as long as he maintained order, the storm would pass. He did not recognize that pressure was not just external. It was reshaping the organization from within, amplifying ambition and resentment in equal measure. The walls were closing in, slowly and methodically. Castellano felt them, even if he did not fully understand their implications. He trusted silence to save him. He trusted systems to hold. And in that trust, he continued down a path that left him increasingly alone, guarded against enemies he could see, and blind to those forming quietly behind him. As the pressures of leadership and surveillance intensified, another vulnerability quietly entered Paul Castellano's life, one that could not be managed through hierarchy or control. His health began to decline, slowly at first, then with increasing significance. Illness introduced uncertainty into a world he had spent decades trying to make predictable. For a man who valued order above all else, the loss of physical certainty was deeply unsettling. Castellano's ailments were not always visible to those outside his inner circle, but they influenced his behavior in subtle ways. Fatigue shortened his patience. Pain made him less inclined to travel or attend meetings. Absences became more frequent, and decisions were delayed. Castellano compensated by tightening control remotely, issuing directives through intermediaries rather than appearing in person. He believed this maintained authority, but it also widened the distance between him and the organization. Within the Gambino family, these absences did not go unnoticed. In a structure already strained by division, the physical unavailability of the boss created uncertainty. Leadership, especially in the mafia, is as much about presence as it is about power. Castellano's health reduced his visibility further, reinforcing perceptions that he was detached from daily realities. Rumors filled the gaps left by silence. Succession, once an abstract concern, began to feel immediate. Castellano did not openly discuss the future, nor did he groom a clear heir. His leadership style did not lend itself to mentorship. Authority flowed downward, but guidance did not. As a result, no single figure emerged as an obvious successor. This ambiguity fueled quiet competition among ambitious captains. Neil Delacroix's own declining health compounded the uncertainty. Delacroix had long served as the emotional anchor of the family, bridging Castellano's corporate authority and the street's loyalty. As illness weakened Delacroix, the stabilizing force he provided began to fade. Castellano assumed that structure alone could maintain order. He underestimated how much the family relied on Delacroix's presence. For men like John Gotti, the changing health dynamics were impossible to ignore. Castellano's reduced involvement signaled vulnerability. Power, once centralized and controlled, now felt distant and abstract. Gotti observed how decisions slowed, how communication became more fragmented. He understood that leadership vacuums rarely remain empty. Castellano's response to his own vulnerability was not openness, but further withdrawal. He did not share his concerns or seek counsel. He believed that revealing weakness invited challenge. In his mind, strength meant silence. This instinct, while consistent with his philosophy, isolated him further at a moment when connection might have preserved stability. Meetings, when they occurred, were more rigid than ever. Castellano focused narrowly on business metrics and compliance. He avoided discussions of future leadership or contingency planning. This avoidance created anxiety. Men wondered what would happen if Castellano became incapacitated. Without clarity, they began to imagine outcomes that favored themselves. The organization continued to function, but its cohesion weakened. Loyalty, already strained, became conditional. Alliances shifted subtly. Conversations took place in rooms Castellano never entered. Plans were discussed quietly, framed as hypotheticals rather than intentions. Castellano, insulated by his routines and intermediaries, did not hear these whispers. Health also affected Castellano's judgment. Fatigue made him more rigid, less willing to compromise. He interpreted dissent as threat, not concern. This hardened stance pushed potential allies further away. Men who might have offered support chose instead to remain silent, waiting. Law enforcement pressure did not ease during this period. Investigations continued steadily, indifferent to Castellano's personal struggles. The convergence of external pressure and internal uncertainty created a volatile environment. Castellano believed discipline could contain it. Others believed change was inevitable. His mansion, once a symbol of control, now felt increasingly like a retreat. Castellano spent more time there, removed from the rhythms of the city and the organization. He trusted reports over presence. He believed that information, even second-hand, was sufficient. He did not see how much nuance was lost in translation. The absence of clear succession planning emboldened ambitious figures. Gotti and others began to assess loyalties more actively. They measured who might support change and who might resist it. Castellano's silence created space for these calculations. His authority remained intact, but its future felt uncertain. Illness has a way of revealing underlying structures. In Castellano's case, it exposed how much his leadership depended on control rather than connection. Without his constant oversight, the systems he trusted began to operate independently. Decisions were made without his input. Loyalty shifted toward those who were present and engaged. Castellano sensed that something was changing, but he misinterpreted its nature. He believed the threat lay primarily with law enforcement. He did not fully appreciate how internal dynamics were evolving. His focus remained outward, guarding against prosecution rather than insurrection. As weeks turned into months, the organization existed in a state of suspended anticipation. Castellano's health issues were not openly discussed, but they shaped behavior nonetheless. Men spoke cautiously, planned quietly, and waited. The future felt unsettled, and in unsettled times, ambition thrives. Castellano continued to rule, but his grip was less certain. He trusted that authority once established did not require reinforcement. He believed that fear and structure would endure. He did not see how absence eroded both. The cracks beneath the throne widened silently. Illness, uncertainty, and isolation converged, weakening the foundation of his power. Castellano remained at the top, but the ground beneath him was shifting. And as history would soon reveal, when leadership becomes distant and vulnerable, others begin to move closer to the center, ready to claim what they believe is about to be left behind. The death of Neil Delacroix marked a moment that many within the Gambino family had quietly feared but rarely discussed aloud. When it finally happened, the loss felt less like an ending and more like the removal of a final restraint. Delacroix had been more than an underboss. He had been a stabilizer, a mediator, and, in many ways, the emotional core of the organization. With him gone, the delicate balance that had held the family together for years was suddenly exposed. Delacroix's illness had been known, but its inevitability did not lessen its impact. For decades, he had served as the bridge between Paul Castellano's distant authority and the street-level reality of the crews. He spoke their language, understood their pressures, and defended their interests when possible. His presence reassured men who felt alienated by Castellano's corporate approach. When Delacroix died, that reassurance vanished overnight. The funeral itself became a moment heavy with unspoken meaning. Soldiers, captains, and associates gathered not only to mourn Delacroix, but to observe one another. Who stood where? Who spoke to whom? Who avoided eye contact? Funerals in the mafia world are never just about grief, they are about alignment. Alliances are measured in glances and silences. On that day, the undercurrent was unmistakable. The buffer was gone. Paul Castellano attended, but his presence felt distant, formal, and constrained. He followed protocol, paid respects, and maintained composure. Yet many noticed what was missing. There was no warmth, no shared sense of loss. Castellano viewed Delacroix's death as unfortunate, but manageable. He believed that structure could replace personality, that hierarchy could absorb the shock. To him, this was a transition, not a crisis. Others saw it differently. Without Delacroix, Castellano's isolation became absolute. The street crews no longer had an advocate at the top. Communication now flowed through rigid channels, stripped of nuance and empathy. Decisions that once benefited from Delacroix's understanding were now filtered entirely through Castellano's perspective. Almost immediately, the effects were felt. Small disputes lingered unresolved. Grievances that Delacroix might have quietly settled were left to fester. Castellano, removed from daily realities, did not see these issues as urgent. He believed discipline would prevail. He did not realize that discipline without mediation breeds resentment. For John Gotti and others like him, Delacroix's death was a turning point. Delacroce had been both protector and constraint. He had shielded Gotti from Castellano's harsher judgments while also discouraging reckless ambition. With him gone, the rules changed. Gotti understood that Castellano now stood alone, and that the emotional loyalty of the family lay elsewhere. Castellano's response to Delacroce's death was telling. Rather than reaching out to the street captains, he retreated further into formality. He reinforced rules, tightened oversight, and reduced communication. He believed this would assert authority and prevent instability. Instead, it deepened the sense of alienation. The absence of Delacroce also removed the last internal check on Castellano's blind spots. There was no longer anyone he trusted enough to challenge him quietly. Advice became affirmation. Reports became reassurance. Castellano heard what his system allowed him to hear, not what he needed to know. Within the family, conversations shifted. Men who had once deferred to Delacroce now spoke openly among themselves. They compared notes, shared frustrations, and speculated about the future. Castellano's name was mentioned less with fear and more with calculation. Respect remained, but it was no longer reinforced by loyalty. The question of succession, once distant, now loomed. Castellano had not named an heir. He had not cultivated a successor. His leadership style did not encourage continuity through mentorship. This vacuum invited ambition. Men began to imagine a family led differently, more visibly, more personally, more aligned with the streets. Castellano believed that fear of consequences would suppress these ambitions. He trusted that his authority, backed by decades of power, was sufficient. He did not recognize how much of that authority had been reinforced by Delacroce's presence. Without that reinforcement, fear alone was not enough. Law enforcement pressure continued unabated during this period, but it was no longer the primary concern for many within the organization. Internal dynamics took precedence. Survival was no longer just about avoiding prosecution, it was about positioning for an uncertain future. Castellano's mansion became quieter, more insular. Decisions were made in isolation, informed by reports that lacked emotional context. He believed the organization remained stable because there was no open rebellion. He mistook silence for acceptance. Delacroce's death removed the final illusion of unity. The family was still intact, but its cohesion was fragile. Loyalty was conditional. Obedience was strategic. Men followed orders while preparing for change. For Castellano, the loss was both personal and strategic, though he framed it primarily as the latter. He did not mourn publicly, nor did he acknowledge the depth of the shift. He believed that time would restore equilibrium. He trusted his system to adapt. But systems built on control struggle in moments that require empathy. Delacroce had provided that empathy without challenging authority. His absence left a void Castellano could not fill, and would not try to fill. As weeks passed, the organization settled into a tense calm. Nothing exploded. Nothing openly collapsed. Yet beneath the surface, alignment was changing. Castellano stood at the top, powerful and alone, unaware that the foundation beneath him had lost its final support. The restraint was gone. What remained was inevitability, quietly taking shape. After the death of Neil Delacroce, the atmosphere within the Gambino family changed in ways that were subtle but irreversible. What had once been contained by tradition and mediation now drifted into calculation. Conversations became quieter, more deliberate. Words were chosen carefully, not out of fear alone, but out of intent. The organization had entered a phase where loyalty was being weighed against survival, and where obedience was no longer enough to guarantee either. Paul Castellano, still firmly in control, did not perceive this shift as a threat. He believed that authority, once established, carried its own momentum. The absence of open defiance reassured him. He interpreted calm as stability. In his mind, dissent would announce itself loudly. He did not account for the kind of dissent that forms in silence. Among the captains and crews most affected by Castellano's leadership style, a different understanding was emerging. They believed the family was drifting away from its core, becoming rigid, disconnected, and vulnerable. Castellano's distance from the streets, his reliance on intermediaries, and his intolerance for deviation had created a leadership vacuum where emotional allegiance once existed. Men who had risked their lives felt unseen and undervalued. John Gotti was not the only one who sensed the opportunity, but he was among the most aware of its implications. He understood that change within the mafia rarely came through open rebellion. It came through consensus among those willing to act. Gotti did not rush. He observed. He listened. He let others speak first. In doing so, he measured how far dissatisfaction had spread. The decision to move against Castellano did not form overnight. It evolved through private conversations, careful assessments, and shared frustrations. Men discussed Castellano's isolation, his refusal to engage, and his growing detachment from the realities of enforcement. They questioned whether his leadership protected the family or endangered it. These discussions were framed not as betrayal, but as necessity. Castellano's hardline stance on drugs and discipline, once seen as protective, now felt hypocritical to those who believed enforcement was uneven. Some saw favoritism, others saw rigidity without understanding. Castellano's refusal to listen reinforced the belief that reform from within was impossible. If change was to come, it would have to come from above, or by removing what stood above. Fear remained a powerful deterrent, but it was no longer absolute. Castellano's authority depended on the assumption that no one would dare act against him. Gotti and his allies began to challenge that assumption quietly. They assessed the risks, weighed loyalties, and calculated consequences. The question was not whether Castellano deserved removal, but whether it could be done. Delacroix's absence loomed over every discussion. He had been the one man capable of discouraging drastic action. With him gone, restraint no longer carried the same weight. Men felt freer to imagine alternatives. They believed that Castellano had lost touch, and that his removal might restore balance rather than disrupt it. Castellano, meanwhile, continued to rule through structure. He did not convene open forums or seek counsel. He believed that leadership meant decisiveness, not dialogue. He issued directives, expecting compliance. He did not see how these directives were received, only that they were obeyed. This obedience masked preparation. While Castellano believed fear maintained order, others used the calm to organize. Trust networks formed quietly, based on shared grievances and mutual interest. Gotti's strength lay not in commanding these networks, but in aligning them. He presented himself not as a revolutionary, but as a corrective force. The idea of assassination, once unthinkable, became discussable. It was not framed as ambition, but as preservation. Castellano, in this narrative, had become a liability, too isolated, too rigid, too exposed. Removing him was seen as a way to protect the family from internal fracture and external threat. Such decisions were not made lightly. The consequences of failure were absolute. Everyone involved understood the risks. Yet the risks of inaction began to feel greater. Castellano's leadership, once stable, now seemed to threaten the family's cohesion. In that calculation, loyalty gave way to pragmatism. Castellano remained unaware of how far these conversations had progressed. His isolation shielded him from rumors and warnings alike. He trusted his intermediaries to report threats. They reported none either because they did not know, or because they chose silence. Castellano mistook this absence of information for security. Plans were discussed without detail, then refined gradually. Locations, timing, and contingencies were considered carefully. The goal was not spectacle, but certainty. Violence, in this context, was viewed as a tool to restore order, not disrupt it. The irony was stark: men who opposed Castellano's rigidity were preparing to remove him with precision and discipline. As the decision hardened, the emotional tone shifted. Anxiety gave way to resolve. There was no celebration, no excitement. Only acceptance. The path forward felt heavy but unavoidable. Castellano had trusted no one, and now no one trusted him. The organization moved quietly, maintaining appearances. Castellano continued his routines, unaware that his authority was being redefined without his involvement. He believed he was still feared. He did not realize he was being replaced in the minds of his subordinates. The final step was commitment. Once crossed, there could be no retreat. Gotti and those aligned with him understood this. They accepted the risk, believing that inaction would lead to slow decay. The decision, once made, was not revisited. In the stillness that followed, the Gambino family appeared unchanged. Operations continued. Orders were followed. But beneath the surface, the future had already been chosen. The moment of action was no longer a question of if, but when. December 16, 1985, arrived with a kind of quiet that softened the city rather than silenced it. New York moved through the day wrapped in winter routines, unaware that one of its most powerful hidden figures was nearing the end of his reign. The air was cold but calm, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. It was the kind of evening that encouraged routine, and Paul Castellano valued routine above all else. Castellano's day followed familiar patterns. He remained largely insulated, moving between controlled environments, trusting that predictability offered safety. Despite the tensions surrounding him, he believed he was secure. Years of authority had taught him that danger announced itself. Silence, in his mind, meant stability. He did not sense the shift that had already occurred beneath him. As evening approached, Castellano prepared to attend a dinner meeting at Spark Steak House in Midtown Manhattan. The restaurant was familiar, respectable, and discreet, an appropriate setting for a man who preferred controlled spaces. It was a public place, but one that offered a sense of anonymity within the city's constant motion. Castellano believed that visibility in such a setting reduced risk. He trusted the environment, the routine, and the assumptions built over decades. The car ride into Manhattan was unremarkable. Traffic moved steadily. Streets glowed under artificial light. The city appeared indifferent, as it always did, to the lives unfolding within it. Castellano sat inside the vehicle, shielded from the cold, his thoughts likely focused on business matters rather than personal danger. He had survived long enough to believe in the endurance of his systems. Unbeknownst to him, others were moving through the same city with purpose sharpened by resolve. Their movements were deliberate, their timing calculated. They blended into the evening, indistinguishable from countless others navigating Manhattan streets. There was no urgency in their demeanor, no sign of the weight they carried. Precision required calm. As Castellano's car approached the restaurant, the surroundings offered no warning. Pedestrians walked by, unaware. Doors opened and closed. The rhythm of the city continued uninterrupted. In moments like these, history often changes quietly, without ceremony. When the car stopped, Castellano stepped out, accompanied by his driver. The entrance to Spark Steak House was well lit, inviting, ordinary. This ordinariness was deceptive. It suggested safety, continuity, routine. Castellano moved toward the door with the confidence of a man who had never been publicly challenged. The moment itself was swift and final. There was no conversation, no confrontation. The violence, when it came, was precise and efficient, executed without chaos. The stillness of the evening fractured briefly, then settled again. Castellano collapsed onto the cold pavement, his authority extinguished in an instant. The city reacted as it always does, to noise, not significance. People nearby froze, startled more by disruption than understanding. Within moments, the scene was flooded with confusion, sirens, and flashing lights. But for Paul Castellano, none of it mattered. The systems he trusted, the distance he maintained, the authority he enforced, all ended there, in front of a restaurant on a Manhattan street. The symbolism was inescapable. Castellano, who believed power should be exercised invisibly, died in public. Castellano, who distrusted proximity, was killed at close range. Castellano, who ruled through structure, fell to a decision made through consensus. The contrast between his philosophy and his end was stark. News spread quickly through the underworld. Shock rippled outward, followed by understanding. Many had anticipated change, but few expected such finality. The assassination was not impulsive. It was the result of months of calculation. In that realization, fear mixed with acceptance. Law enforcement responded immediately, cordoning off the area, questioning witnesses, and beginning investigations that would stretch on for years. To them, this was a crime scene. To the mafia, it was a declaration. Leadership had changed hands through the oldest method, despite all attempts at modernization. For those who had orchestrated the event, there was no celebration. Relief was muted by awareness of consequence. Power obtained this way demanded justification and consolidation. The moment was not an ending, but a beginning fraught with risk. As the body was removed and the street gradually returned to normal, the city resumed its rhythm. Traffic flowed. Restaurants reopened. Night deepened. New York absorbed the shock and moved on, indifferent as ever. In Staten Island, the mansion on Toad Hill stood silent, unaware that its purpose had ended. Files, routines, and structures remained, but the mind that directed them was gone. Castellano's vision, once so carefully constructed, now belonged to history. The assassination marked the end of an era defined by distance and control. It also marked the beginning of another, defined by visibility and charisma. The transition was abrupt, but its roots were long. December 16, 1985, would be remembered not just as the night Paul Castellano died, but as the moment when the mafia chose a different path. And in the quiet that followed, the true weight of that choice began to settle. The immediate aftermath of Paul Castellano's death unfolded with a mixture of disbelief, calculation, and quiet adjustment. In the moments following the assassination, confusion dominated the street outside Sparks' Steak House. Sirens cut through the winter air, lights reflected off wet pavement, and passers-by struggled to understand what they had witnessed. Yet beyond the police barricades, in rooms where such events were interpreted not as tragedies but as shifts in power, clarity arrived quickly. Within the Gambino family, shock gave way to recognition. Castellano's death had been anticipated by some, but its execution in such a public and definitive manner carried symbolic weight. This was not a covert removal. It was a statement. The message was unmistakable: authority had changed, and it had done so without hesitation. Those who had waited quietly now understood that waiting was over. Fear spread unevenly. Some worried about retaliation, law enforcement scrutiny, and internal chaos. Others felt relief, believing that an era of rigidity had ended. For many, emotions were complex and conflicted. Castellano had been powerful, but distant. Respected, but not loved. His absence created space that needed to be filled quickly to prevent disorder. John Gotti moved swiftly, but not visibly. The days following the assassination were marked by restraint rather than celebration. Meetings were held discreetly. Messages were conveyed carefully. The priority was stability. Gotti understood that power obtained through violence required immediate legitimacy. The family needed to function, and it needed to believe that order would continue. Law enforcement, meanwhile, intensified its response. The boldness of the assassination drew national attention. Investigators recognized the significance of the moment and responded with urgency. Surveillance increased. Interviews multiplied. The public nature of the killing made it impossible to ignore. For authorities, Castellano's death was both a crime and an opportunity. Within the mafia, however, public attention mattered less than internal alignment. Captains assessed the situation pragmatically. Castellano was gone. The question was not whether this was right or wrong, but what came next. Loyalty in such moments is shaped by survival. Those who sensed the direction of power adjusted accordingly. Gotti's approach contrasted sharply with Castellano's. Where Castellano had ruled from isolation, Gotti understood the importance of presence. He began to re-engage with the street-level leadership, listening, reassuring, and projecting confidence. This shift was deliberate. Gotti aimed to restore the emotional connection Castellano had abandoned. Rumors circulated quickly, but certainty spread faster. The absence of retaliation signaled consensus. The lack of internal resistance confirmed alignment. Castellano's systems, once thought unbreakable, dissolved without him. The family adapted with surprising speed. Castellano's supporters, few as they were, recognized reality. Without the boss, structure alone offered no protection. They aligned themselves with the new order, prioritizing continuity over loyalty to a fallen leader. In the mafia world, survival depends on adaptation. The broader underworld reacted with caution. Other families observed closely, gauging whether the assassination would destabilize alliances or provoke conflict. The fact that it did not suggested control rather than chaos. Gotti's rise appeared contained, disciplined, and accepted. Castellano's death also reshaped internal narratives. Actions once criticized were reframed. His distance, once seen as caution, was now interpreted as weakness. His corporate vision, once admired by some, was questioned. History began to reassign meaning to his decisions. Law enforcement investigations continued, but the immediate opportunity to exploit chaos faded as order reasserted itself. The Gambino family functioned, adapted, and moved forward. This resilience reinforced the perception that the assassination had been strategic rather than reckless. Emotionally, Castellano's absence lingered unevenly. He operated within Gambino's protective shadow, gaining authority while avoiding open conflict. He did not seek to replace the existing culture immediately. Instead, he positioned himself as a complement to it. His focus remained on profitability and structure, while others maintained the traditional rituals of loyalty and respect. During this period, Castellano refined his leadership philosophy further. He observed how Gambino managed power not through fear but through consistency. Decisions were deliberate, rarely impulsive. Punishments were measured. Rewards were calculated. Castellano absorbed these methods and adapted them to his own temperament. Where Gambino was naturally charismatic in his own quiet way, Castellano relied more heavily on distance. He believed authority was enhanced by formality. As Gambino's health began to decline in the early 1970s, questions of succession grew more pressing. Castellano's name was rarely spoken openly, but it hovered in the background of every serious conversation. Gambino did not announce his intentions publicly. He preferred to let events unfold according to his design, minimizing disruption. Castellano continued to fulfill his duties without change in demeanor, never appearing eager or entitled. When Gambino finally made his decision, it reflected his deepest instincts. He chose Castellano not because he was beloved, but because he was predictable. In a world defined by volatility, predictability was priceless. Gambino believed Castellano would preserve the family's wealth, maintain its alliances, and avoid the reckless behavior that attracted law enforcement. He trusted Castellano to think in decades rather than moments. This decision, however, carried consequences Gambino may have underestimated. By favoring Castellano, he reinforced the perception that lineage and business acumen mattered more than street loyalty. This created quiet resentment among those who felt bypassed. They did not challenge Gambino directly, his authority was unquestioned, but they stored their grievances for the future. For Castellano, the weight of Gambino's trust was both an honor and a burden. He understood the responsibility he was being given. He also understood the expectations that came with it. He did not attempt to bridge the emotional gap with his critics. Instead, he doubled down on his belief that authority should not seek approval. He trusted the structure Gambino had built and believed he could maintain it through discipline alone. As the era of Carlo Gambino neared its end, Castellano stood poised at the threshold of ultimate power. He had been groomed not through spectacle, but through silence. He had learned from a master who valued survival above all else. Yet the very qualities that earned Gambino's trust were already sowing division within the family. Castellano was inheriting not only an empire, but also the fault lines that ran beneath it. The shadow of Carlo Gambino had protected him, guided him, and elevated him. There was no widespread mourning within the organization. Grief was private, limited to those few who had personal connections to him. For most, the transition felt inevitable. The family had outgrown his leadership style. The mansion on Toad Hill became a relic almost overnight. Its significance diminished as the center of power shifted. Castellano's routines, files, and structures were left behind, symbols of an approach that had failed to sustain loyalty. Public perception focused on the drama of the assassination, but the true impact was quieter. The shockwaves rippled through relationships, expectations, and leadership norms. Castellano's death reinforced a lesson long understood in organized crime: power is only as strong as the loyalty beneath it. As days turned into weeks, the narrative settled. Castellano was remembered as a powerful but isolated figure. His death marked a turning point, not just for the Gambino family, but for the mafia's approach to leadership. The transition was complete not because of celebration, but because of acceptance. Castellano's era had ended. A new one had begun. And in that quiet acceptance, the true finality of his reign became clear. With Paul Castellano removed from power, the Gambino family entered a new era defined less by structure and discipline and more by visibility, personality, and street-level influence. John Gotti, having orchestrated the transition with precision and patience, now faced the challenge of consolidating authority while navigating the lingering tensions left by decades of rigid leadership. Where Castellano had ruled from distance, Gotti understood that presence was power. Leadership, in his view, required engagement, charisma, and an ability to command loyalty through both respect and fear. Gotti's approach contrasted sharply with the corporate style that Castellano had championed. He did not retreat into offices or manage operations solely through intermediaries. Instead, he made himself visible, visiting crews, listening to captains, and projecting confidence. He understood that the perception of power was as crucial as the power itself. Men who might have been indifferent or resentful under Castellano's rule were now drawn toward Gotti, reassured by his presence and inspired by his decisiveness. The shift was immediate and palpable. Street-level soldiers, previously alienated by Castellano's distance, now felt seen and heard. Gotti's charisma allowed him to engage with them personally, fostering loyalty that went beyond fear of punishment. He attended to grievances, rewarded initiative, and maintained a sense of personal connection. This style reinforced his authority in a way that Castellano's corporate approach never could. Loyalty became emotional as well as functional. Gotti's visibility also served as a deterrent. By being present, he signaled that challenges to his authority would be noticed and addressed swiftly. His reputation for decisiveness and willingness to use violence when necessary created an aura that combined respect with fear. Unlike Castellano, whose power relied on distance and hierarchy, Gotti's power relied on perception and immediacy. Men understood that loyalty to him was advantageous, and disloyalty could be fatal. Consolidation of power required more than charisma. Gotti worked carefully to align key captains and crews with his vision. He navigated residual loyalty to Castellano, neutralizing potential opposition without unnecessary conflict. Alliances were reinforced through both incentives and subtle intimidation. Those who might have resisted were reminded of the consequences of defiance, while those who supported him were rewarded tangibly. In this way, Gotti transformed potential fragmentation into cohesion. The contrast between Castellano's and Gotti's leadership was stark. Castellano had prioritized stability and predictability, focusing on white-collar operations and long-term strategy. Gotti, while still attentive to profitability, emphasized immediacy, visibility, and street credibility. Decisions were often made quickly, reflecting the realities of the streets rather than purely financial considerations. This approach increased risk but also generated loyalty and respect. For many within the family, it was refreshing after years of corporate-style detachment. Gotti's rise also sent a clear message beyond the family. Other mafia families and criminal associates observed the transition carefully, noting that authority had changed hands decisively and that Gotti had successfully navigated both internal and external pressures. His style projected strength and adaptability, signaling that the Gambino family remained formidable despite recent upheaval. Reputation, long a critical currency in organized crime, was enhanced immediately. Internal operations underwent subtle but significant changes. Gotti encouraged greater communication between street crews and leadership. Reports were expected, but dialogue became more frequent and personal. The rigidity that characterized Castellano's tenure gave way to a more dynamic and responsive structure. While discipline remained important, it was balanced with recognition of initiative and loyalty. Men were motivated not only by fear but by admiration and opportunity. The transformation was not without tension. Gotti's visibility and engagement made him more exposed to law enforcement. Federal attention, always present in New York's organized crime scene, now focused directly on the new boss. Where Castellano's isolation had provided a layer of protection, Gotti's approach attracted attention. He accepted this risk as part of leadership, believing that the benefits of personal influence outweighed the dangers of scrutiny. Despite the increased exposure, Gotti's popularity within the family grew steadily. Soldiers and captains began to see him as a leader who understood their challenges, respected their contributions, and rewarded loyalty visibly. Emotional allegiance replaced the transactional obedience that had defined Castellano's rule. This shift strengthened cohesion and stabilized the organization in the immediate aftermath of a violent transition. Gotti also recognized the symbolic importance of his approach. Leadership in the mafia is as much about perception as about actual control. By contrasting himself with Castellano's distant style, he highlighted his own accessibility, decisiveness, and connection to the streets. This contrast reinforced his legitimacy, both internally and externally. Gotti became not only the new boss but a figure whose style embodied a renewed identity for the Gambino family. The consolidation of power under Gotti also involved careful management of potential rivals. Figures who had aligned with Castellano were assessed for loyalty, capability, and adaptability. Gotti cultivated relationships with those who demonstrated pragmatism, neutralized threats without unnecessary violence, and rewarded those whose allegiance enhanced stability. The balance of fear, respect, and reward became the foundation of his authority. Publicly, Gotti projected confidence and control. He maintained appearances, attended events selectively, and managed perception with precision. The media, intrigued by his charisma and presence, began to notice the new figure at the center of the Gambino family. This visibility, while dangerous, reinforced his power and reputation. Castellano's invisibility had shielded him from scrutiny, but Gotti understood that reputation itself was a tool, and he wielded it deliberately. Over time, the Gambino family adapted to this new leadership model. Operations continued, loyalty was reinforced, and cohesion strengthened. The contrast between Castellano's corporate approach and Gotti's street-oriented style became a defining characteristic of the family's identity. Gotti's era was immediate, personal, and visible, a reflection of both his personality and the demands of the organization he now commanded. In retrospect, Gotti's ascension was not merely a change of leadership. It represented a shift in philosophy, method, and culture. Where Castellano relied on distance and structure, Gotti relied on presence and perception. Where Castellano trusted systems, Gotti trusted loyalty and instinct. This transformation reshaped the Gambino family, setting a new tone for operations, relationships, and the very nature of authority within organized crime. With Paul Castellano gone and the Gambino family firmly in the hands of John Gotti, a quiet question lingered among those who observed the organization and its history: was Castellano right all along? The inquiry was not simply a matter of hindsight. It touched on the fundamental nature of leadership, the delicate balance between fear and loyalty, and the costs of isolation at the top of a hierarchy. Castellano had built his empire around principles that were logical, disciplined, and precise, yet they had left him vulnerable in ways he may never have anticipated. Castellano's worldview had been shaped by decades of observation, family traditions, and experience. From his earliest days in Brooklyn, he had absorbed lessons about hierarchy, trust, and the consequences of carelessness. He understood that in the world of organized crime, emotion was often dangerous, and proximity could be fatal. Rules, structure, and distance were the tools he believed would safeguard both himself and the family. In theory, these principles made sense. They had allowed him to rise through the ranks without the dramatic violence and exposure that claimed others. His insistence on control and formal authority was a defining feature. Castellano trusted systems over individuals because systems did not betray. He compartmentalized information, insulated himself from unnecessary risk, and avoided public visibility. He discouraged behavior that drew attention, particularly drug trafficking, which he viewed as an invitation for law enforcement scrutiny. Castellano believed that meticulous management could preserve the family, its operations, and its longevity. He sought stability above all else. Yet the very principles that had protected him also created distance. Castellano rarely interacted personally with street crews. Decisions were delivered from offices, often through intermediaries. Emotional bonds, traditionally a source of loyalty in the mafia, were intentionally minimized. He believed affection clouded judgment. Others interpreted his approach as coldness, even arrogance. Fear replaced devotion, and compliance replaced enthusiasm. The human element, the glue that holds an organization together, was weakened, though Castellano may not have fully realized it. This tension raises the question: was Castellano's caution wise, or did it become a vulnerability? On one hand, his strategies minimized risk in a volatile world. He avoided unnecessary conflict, maintained profitable operations, and reduced exposure to law enforcement. He believed in foresight, in preparing for decades rather than moments. In many respects, his approach was rational, almost prescient. In a family plagued by impulsive decisions and violent turnovers, Castellano's prudence should have been an asset. On the other hand, his methods alienated those whose loyalty mattered most. Soldiers, captains, and even influential allies like Delacroix were kept at arm's length. Emotional distance created opportunity for ambition and resentment to grow unnoticed. By prioritizing systems and isolation, Castellano had inadvertently weakened the social bonds that underpin hierarchical authority. Compliance was observed, but connection was absent. In the absence of Delacroix's stabilizing presence, the vulnerabilities became critical. The culmination of these factors became painfully clear in the months leading up to his assassination. Castellano's trust in structure, hierarchy, and fear proved insufficient to counter the ambitions of men like Gotti, who understood the importance of presence and personal loyalty. Where Castellano relied on distance to ensure control, Gotti leveraged proximity, charisma, and emotional intelligence to command allegiance. Castellano had minimized personal risk, but he had not accounted for the internal calculations that can emerge when those closest to power feel alienated. Examining Castellano's principles in isolation, it is easy to argue that he was right. Systems, discipline, and careful management reduce exposure, enhance predictability, and allow for long-term planning. In an environment defined by chaos and danger, his philosophy prioritized survival. His avoidance of unnecessary confrontation and reckless visibility aligned with the lessons he had learned over decades: power is maintained not by display, but by control. Yet the practical outcome of his philosophy demonstrates its limits. Human organizations, particularly those built on loyalty, trust, and fear, require more than logic. They require perception, emotional connection, and adaptability. Castellano's reliance on formal structures created an environment in which obedience could exist without genuine allegiance. The systems functioned, but the people who operated within them were no longer fully invested in their leader. In essence, his method protected him from external threats while leaving him exposed to the internal ones. There is also the question of timing and context. Castellano's era had coincided with a period of increasing law enforcement sophistication. Wiretaps, surveillance, and RICO statutes threatened leadership based on visibility and action. From a purely defensive perspective, Castellano's cautious, corporate-style approach was rational. It sought to minimize exposure in an increasingly risky world. But leadership in the mafia is not governed solely by risk avoidance, it is governed by perception, respect, and the ability to maintain control over people, not just operations. Reflecting on his choices, it is apparent that Castellano's error was not in valuing caution, but in undervaluing human dynamics. Fear may enforce compliance, but it does not cultivate loyalty. Distance may reduce risk, but it also reduces awareness. Castellano trusted rules, systems, and hierarchy, but he underestimated ambition, resentment, and calculation. He did not foresee how his absence from the streets, combined with a lack of personal connection, would allow Gotti to rise in influence and ultimately challenge his authority. Moreover, Castellano's worldview highlights a broader truth about leadership: the most effective leaders balance control with connection. Castellano excelled in control, but his connection was minimal. Gotti, by contrast, leveraged personal influence, visibility, and emotional engagement to secure allegiance. The contrast underscores a critical lesson: leadership in human organizations is as much about perception and relationships as it is about logic and structure. In considering whether Castellano was right, one must distinguish between philosophy and execution. His philosophy was internally consistent, rational, and grounded in decades of experience. It emphasized discipline, risk management, and long-term strategy. Yet execution, particularly the way he applied these principles to human relationships, proved insufficient. The mafia is not a machine, it is a network of people with desires, grievances, and ambitions. Castellano's methods protected him from many external threats but could not compensate for the internal erosion of loyalty. Ultimately, Castellano's life and death provide a study in the paradox of control. Absolute caution may preserve operations, but without relational insight, it leaves leaders vulnerable to those who understand the human element. Castellano trusted no one, and in doing so, he isolated himself from the very loyalty that might have saved him. He was right to prioritize systems, rules, and discretion, but incomplete in recognizing that leadership requires both strategy and engagement. As history reflects on Castellano, it becomes clear that his vision of leadership was ahead of its time in some respects, yet limited in others. He anticipated risks that others ignored, and he sought to shield the organization from external threats. But his detachment from the people who enacted his directives ultimately became his undoing. In the end, Castellano's life raises a profound question: can authority survive when it is based solely on control, without the reinforcement of trust and connection? His story suggests that caution alone, no matter how meticulous, cannot safeguard a leader from the ambitions of those closest to power. In the years following Paul Castellano's death, his legacy became a subject of quiet debate within both organized crime circles and the broader world of historians, journalists, and criminal justice observers. Unlike the flamboyant figures who followed him, Castellano's presence had been subtle, his influence largely invisible to the public eye. He was not remembered for street-level bravado or media attention, but for the careful construction of an empire built on discipline, efficiency, and long-term vision. To many, he was a misunderstood architect of organized crime, whose methods were as methodical as they were effective, even if ultimately insufficient to protect him from betrayal. Castellano's impact on the Gambino family was profound. Under his leadership, the organization had become more than a loose network of street crews and neighborhood enforcers. He introduced a level of corporate sophistication that was unprecedented within the American mafia. Businesses were streamlined, unions manipulated subtly, and revenue streams diversified across legitimate industries and controlled enterprises. Profits flowed steadily, often with minimal public attention or violent disruption. In this sense, Castellano's influence extended beyond the criminal world, shaping the very way organized crime interacted with the broader economy. Yet his methods were polarizing within the family. Soldiers and captains, accustomed to a more visible, personal style of leadership, often resented Castellano's distance. They felt alienated by his reliance on intermediaries, his formalized protocols, and his emphasis on structure over personal loyalty. To outsiders, these qualities were seen as prudence. To those on the street, they were seen as coldness. Castellano's insistence on order and compliance often came at the expense of connection, creating a leadership that was respected more for fear than affection. This paradox became a defining feature of his legacy. He was effective, yet emotionally isolated. Historians who study Castellano's era often highlight the contrast between him and successors like John Gotti. Where Gotti relied on charisma, visibility, and emotional engagement to command loyalty, Castellano relied on hierarchy, rules, and discipline. His approach minimized unnecessary risk and allowed the Gambino family to thrive economically, but it failed to account for the ambitions and resentments that could grow quietly beneath the surface. Castellano's downfall, in many ways, was a product of the very principles that had guided his rise: isolation, formalism, and the prioritization of systems over relationships. Despite the criticism, Castellano's innovations had lasting effects. The strategies he implemented, diversifying operations, controlling unions and legitimate businesses, and minimizing street violence, became a model for organized crime operations beyond the Gambino family. Future leaders, both within the mafia and in other criminal enterprises, adopted aspects of his approach. He demonstrated that organized crime could be managed as a business, rather than merely as a network of enforcers and extortionists. In this sense, his legacy extended beyond his personal survival. It influenced the structural evolution of the mafia for decades. Public perception, however, has often overshadowed these contributions. Castellano's assassination became the focal point of his story, defining him in the popular imagination as the boss who was removed because he was too distant, too detached, too cautious. Media narratives emphasized the drama of his death, the contrast with Gotti's flamboyance, and the audacity of the public assassination. The complexity of his methods, the careful orchestration of operations, the attention to long-term profitability, and the disciplined control of his empire, was often reduced to a footnote in stories about violence and betrayal. Within organized crime itself, Castellano's reputation remained mixed. Some remembered him with respect, acknowledging his intelligence, discipline, and ability to maintain a vast and complex organization. Others regarded him as rigid, aloof, and out of touch with the street-level realities that drove loyalty and influence. These differing perspectives underscore a central tension in his legacy. Castellano was simultaneously a visionary and a cautionary tale, a man who understood strategy but underestimated the human element in leadership. Financially, Castellano left a tangible imprint. He had created systems for revenue collection and investment that allowed the family to generate substantial wealth while reducing exposure to law enforcement. Union influence, construction contracts, and distribution networks were meticulously managed, creating streams of income that were predictable and sustainable. This approach contrasted sharply with the high-risk, high-visibility methods of other leaders. It allowed the family to endure during periods of external pressure and internal uncertainty. For scholars and law enforcement analysts, these operational strategies are often cited as evidence of Castellano's sophisticated understanding of power and economics within organized crime. Moreover, Castellano's emphasis on structure over spectacle reshaped expectations for leadership within the mafia. He demonstrated that authority could be exercised without constant physical presence, that control could be maintained through rules and protocols, and that visibility, while sometimes necessary, was not the only measure of influence. His methods created a framework for future bosses to manage complex organizations more efficiently, even if they did not adopt his emotional detachment. At the same time, his legacy serves as a lesson in the limits of authority without personal connection. Castellano's downfall highlights the importance of balancing strategic acumen with relational intelligence. Fear and discipline can maintain compliance, but they cannot fully secure loyalty. Structure can enforce order, but it cannot replace the bonds that bind human organizations together. This duality, strength in system, weakness in connection, is perhaps the most enduring aspect of his story. For those who study the history of the American Mafia, Castellano is often framed as an architect of modernization. His strategies anticipated the increasing sophistication of law enforcement, the growing importance of financial oversight, and the value of long-term planning. Yet his life also illustrates the vulnerabilities inherent in relying solely on structure and control. Leaders who prioritize efficiency over engagement may find their systems vulnerable to the ambitions of those closest to power. Castellano's story, therefore, is both instructional and cautionary. In popular culture and historical accounts, Castellano's memory remains nuanced. He is neither the romanticized, violent figure often associated with the mafia nor the flamboyant celebrity criminal that Gotti became. He is remembered as a man of intelligence, foresight, and discipline, a boss who trusted no one, controlled everything he could, and shaped an empire quietly but effectively. His assassination, while dramatic, does not erase the contributions he made to the operational evolution of organized crime. Ultimately, Castellano's legacy is defined by contrast. He represents the tension between control and connection, between strategy and empathy, between innovation and human fallibility. His reign demonstrated that power can be exercised through order, discipline, and foresight, but also that isolation at the top creates vulnerabilities that even the most carefully constructed systems cannot prevent. In this way, Paul Castellano remains a complex and instructive figure, both a forgotten architect of modern organized crime and a cautionary example of the limits of authority without trust. In the quiet aftermath of Paul Castellano's life and death, reflection reveals the full measure of a man who ruled through control, discipline, and distance. His story, often overshadowed by the violence and spectacle that followed, is one of complexity, foresight, and contradiction. Castellano's reign demonstrates the paradox of power in human organizations: the higher one rises, the fewer people one can trust, and the more isolation becomes both a tool and a vulnerability. His legacy is defined not by spectacle, but by the subtle architecture of influence he constructed and the lessons left in the wake of his absence. Castellano's power was remarkable for its methodical precision. Unlike his contemporaries who relied on visibility, intimidation, and rapid action, he sought authority through structure, rules, and measured enforcement. He understood that organizations, even criminal ones, function best when information is controlled, hierarchy is respected, and decisions are deliberate. In doing so, he created a system capable of generating vast wealth and influence while maintaining a facade of calm. His was a corporate approach to the underworld, one that emphasized longevity over immediacy, calculation over impulse, and oversight over personal engagement. Yet with such calculated authority came isolation. Castellano trusted systems more than people, and rules more than relationships. Emotional distance was a conscious choice, a protective mechanism shaped by decades of observation. He had witnessed betrayal, ambition, and opportunism, and he had concluded that closeness often invited danger. By maintaining separation, he sought to safeguard himself, the organization, and the legacy he was building. This distance, however, also made him vulnerable to those willing to act where he could not see. The tension between Castellano's philosophy and its consequences is central to understanding his life. Systems and rules can enforce compliance, but they cannot inspire loyalty in the same way personal connection does. Obedience secured by fear or expectation is brittle, it holds until ambition or resentment finds opportunity. Castellano's downfall was a product of the very methods that had elevated him. His focus on order, structure, and control blinded him to the ambitions of John Gotti and others who had observed his distance and calculated that his removal could be executed with precision. Castellano's personal qualities further shaped this paradox. He was intelligent, disciplined, and highly strategic. He understood economics, organization, and the importance of measured risk. His investments in legitimate businesses, union influence, and controlled operations reflected a vision of the mafia as a sustainable, long-term enterprise rather than a series of reactive street conflicts. Yet his strength in planning was paired with a weakness in relational awareness. He underestimated the emotional currents within his own family, failing to recognize how alienation, resentment, and ambition could converge against him. The assassination that ended Castellano's life was both abrupt and symbolic. It illustrated the limits of authority based solely on structure and fear. In a moment, decades of meticulous control were undone by ambition, alliance, and opportunity. The very systems that had protected him were powerless to prevent a threat that came from within, shaped by loyalty, perception, and timing. His death serves as a reminder that leadership requires balance. Strategy and structure must be paired with connection, authority with empathy, and foresight with attention to human motivation. Yet Castellano's legacy is not defined only by his death. His innovations in managing operations, mitigating risk, and integrating criminal and legitimate enterprise have left an enduring mark on organized crime. He demonstrated that the mafia could function efficiently and quietly, generating wealth and influence while minimizing the chaos that had traditionally characterized the organization. Future leaders, both within the Gambino family and beyond, would adopt aspects of his approach, blending discipline and strategic oversight with the more traditional reliance on loyalty and visibility. History also remembers Castellano for the contrasts his life presents. He was a man of logic and caution, yet vulnerable to human ambition. He trusted systems, yet could not account for the unpredictability of those closest to him. He sought stability, yet his methods created alienation. These contradictions make him a uniquely instructive figure. His story is a study in the interplay between power and isolation, discipline and humanity, foresight and perception. For those who study organized crime, Castellano's life illustrates the delicate balance necessary in leadership. Authority cannot rest solely on fear, nor can it thrive without trust. Systems and hierarchy are essential for order, but connection is essential for resilience. Castellano's example shows that even the most meticulous planning cannot fully account for the human element, and that isolation at the top, while protective, can be fatal if it blinds a leader to the ambitions and resentments forming beneath. In the broader context of the American Mafia, Castellano's era represents a turning point. He demonstrated the potential for modernization, emphasizing financial oversight, diversification, and strategic control. At the same time, his downfall highlighted the dangers of neglecting relational dynamics and the emotional currents that drive loyalty. These lessons resonate beyond his life, offering insight into the challenges of leadership in any hierarchical organization where human behavior is as important as structure and strategy. Ultimately, the story of Paul Castellano is one of reflection and paradox. He was a man who achieved extraordinary power through intelligence, discipline, and vision, yet he was undone by the very principles that guided his ascent. He trusted systems over people, rules over relationships, and distance over connection. In doing so, he preserved his empire for decades, yet left himself exposed to betrayal. His life and death illustrate the dual nature of authority, that power requires not only control, but awareness, not only strategy, but engagement, not only foresight, but understanding of the human heart. In the quiet aftermath, Castellano's influence endures. The Gambino family continued, transformed by his strategies and reshaped by the lessons of his isolation. His life serves as a study in the complexity of leadership, a narrative of both achievement and vulnerability, a reminder that power, no matter how carefully exercised, is inseparable from the people it seeks to govern. And in that reflection, Paul Castellano remains a figure of both caution and admiration, a man who ruled with discipline, thought with precision, and left a legacy that endures in the subtle architecture of authority and the enduring lessons of trust, distance, and human ambition.